The Ukrainian delegation, led by Kyrylo Budanov, has arrived in the United States. Their mission to discuss key details of a peace agreement and $800 billion plan for Ukraine's economic recovery. Meanwhile, on the global stage, tensions are rising. Donald Trump has revived threats over Greenland, while Congress and U.S. allies work to retain in the president to avoid geopolitical shocks. Analysts warn if the West gets distracted by those ambitions, it could play straight into Moscow's hands and weaken NATO's unity. A Ukrainian delegation has arrived in the U.S. led by Kyrylo Budanov. The team also includes Rustem Umerov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, and David Arahami, head of the Servant of the People faction. The visit, confirmed on January 17th, will focus on discussions over key details of a potential peace agreement. The delegation is set to meet U.S. President Special Envoys Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, along with Daniel Driscoll. During the talks, the Ukrainian and American sides will review two major documents: $800 billion plan and U.S. security guarantees. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has already shared his expectations for the outcome of the visit.
We are currently working on two documents. The team has gone to the United States, as I mentioned in my statement, to finalize certain materials concerning security guarantees and the prosperity package. If everything is finalized and accepted by the U.S. side, because from our side I believe everything is already complete, then signing could take place during Davos. The issue is not about urgently signing today. What matters is that all aspects we discussed with our partners are included, so that Ukraine is not left exposed and vulnerable after the war.
It is worth noting that the prosperity package for Ukraine's reconstruction, valued at $800 billion, could be signed by President Volodymyr Zelensky and U.S. President Donald Trump at the World Economic Forum in Davos next week. This agreement plans to mobilize $800 billion over the next decade to rebuild Ukraine through a mix of loans, grants, and private sector investments. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is reportedly considering the creation of a peace council for Ukraine, modeled after the Gaza Strip. The council would be responsible for overseeing the implementation of the upcoming ceasefire agreement, with the U.S. president directly heading the body. The information was reported by the Financial Times. The Peace Council was initially part of the peace plan for the Gaza Strip under Donald Trump's mediation. The council was to be headed by the U.S. president himself, with the primary role of coordinating governance over Palestinian territories. According to a senior Ukrainian official involved in the talks with the United States, establishing a similar council for Ukraine is a key element of proposals aimed at ending Russia's war against Ukraine. In Ukraine's case, Donald Trump could also head the organization. The proposed council would include representatives from Ukraine, Europe, NATO, and Russia. Its main responsibility would be to monitor compliance with the upcoming peace plan and oversee its implementation. Additionally, the U.S. is reportedly considering creating a similar council for Venezuela. Official proposals for both councils are expected to be presented at the World Economic Forum in Davos next week. Russia is spreading false claims about the capture of Kupiansk in the attempt to influence U.S. decision on peace negotiations. This assessment comes from the Institute for the Study of the War. According to the Institute, Russian Defense Ministry Andrei Belousov received a report from the commander of Russia's Western military group, Sergei Kuzovlev, claiming advancement near Kupiansk and control over all districts of the city. Senior Russian officials have been spreading such false claims since November last year. In reality, Ukrainian defense forces have liberated most of the city and its suburbs. Analysts assess that the Russian military command is systematically lying about Kupiansk despite numerous visual evidences and contradictory reports. Even Russian war correspondents close to the Kremlin reject the alternative reality at the front lines created by dictator Putin and the senior Russian military leaders. They repeatedly dispute Moscow's claims of the control over Kupiansk, Kupets-Vuzlovy, and the eastern suburbs. Some correspondents describe the Russian presence in the city as a few defensive pockets and localized defense, calling the reports from the Russian Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov a parallel reality. Russian military bloggers also confirmed that occupation forces never controlled Kupiansk for a single day. The systematic spread of false information about the front in Ukraine is a part of Russia's broader information warfare aimed at influencing the U.S. and ongoing peace negotiations. Kremlin fakes about the Russian army's success are intended to create a sense of Russia's inevitable victory and pressure Ukraine and the West to accept Moscow's ultimatums. Analysts describe Kupiansk as a particularly sensitive point for the Kremlin, likely due to concern that the real situation on the ground undermines the narrative of Russia's military strengths. The United States is once again capturing global attention, and this time it's not just about the Russian war against Ukraine. President Donald Trump has reignited his focus on Greenland. From threats of tariffs to potential military action, his ambitions are raising alarms in Congress, among NATO allies, and all across Europe. While Republicans try to rein in the president and Democrats prepare to publicly push back, analysts warn that these moves distract the West from the real threat, Russia's war against Ukraine, and could play straight into Moscow's hands. On January 16th, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that he is considering imposing new tariffs on countries opposing American control over Greenland. The remarks come following rising tensions with allies critical of Washington's ambition over the strategically important island.
And I may do that for Greenland too. I may put a tariff on countries if they don't go along with Greenland, because we need Greenland for national security. So I may do that. I'll give you a little, I'll take you out of the, in fact, that'll end up being the story. But actually, this is a much bigger story because we're reducing healthcare by numbers that you haven't seen.
Yes, President Donald Trump did not specify which country could be targeted by his threatened new tariffs. During his first term, Trump proposed that Denmark sell Greenland to the U.S., but the offer was rejected. After winning the presidential election in December 2024, he stated that the U.S. considers ownership and control of Greenland an absolute necessity for national security and global freedom. In January last year, Trump did not rule out using military or economic pressure to secure control over the island. Following a U.S. operation in Venezuela, he returned to threats regarding Greenland. The White House has not ruled out military force, while the State Department officially cited intentions to purchase the territory. Trump argues that if the U.S. does not control the island, Russia or China could occupy it, as Greenland has no independent defense. Politico reports that Republicans in Congress are attempting to bring Trump back to reality regarding his plan to seize Greenland. As Trump continues to threaten to annex Denmark's autonomous territory, despite objections from key international allies and the island itself, some Republican lawmakers are stepping up warnings and pursuing diplomatic measures. Meanwhile, Democrats are preparing to formally oppose any potential military intervention. Republican Senator Tom Tillis noted that members from both parties could come together to demand action from Congress if it becomes clear that Trump is prepared to use military force.
If there was any sort of action that looked like the goal was actually landing in Greenland and doing an illegal taking, there'd be sufficient numbers here to pass a war powers resolution and withstand a veto.
Republican Congressman Don Bacon even warned that any decision to carry out a military takeover of Greenland could lead to impeachment, calling Trump's obsession with the island, I quote, the dumbest thing he has ever heard. These blunt public statements come as lawmakers in private are trying to reassure U.S. allies, including Denmark. A bipartisan group of representatives from the House and Senate traveled to Copenhagen on Friday, January 16th, to personally assure the Danes that any military action lacks congressional support. Senate Majority Leader John Thune did not join the delegation, but in comments to journalists this week largely echoed the delegation's message, stating, I quote, "There is certainly no appetite here to consider some of the options that have been discussed," clearly referring to military measures. This pushback represents one of the deepest rifts between Republican lawmakers and Trump since the start of his second term. So far, Republican concerns about the president's foreign policy moves have not resulted in any effective measures to restrain him. Meanwhile, journalists from the same outlet report that Europe is surprised by Trump's Greenland ambitions. Anonymous officials say that Trump's insistence on controlling Greenland undermines NATO unity, distracts from the war in Ukraine, and could play into Moscow's hands. According to European officials, Trump's insistence on a potential annexation of Greenland, despite categorical objections from Denmark, the island itself, and NATO allies, distracts the West from the real threat, and this threat is Russia's war against Ukraine.
What I find extremely worrying is seeing that in NATO and the EU, some are starting to accept the narrative about Russian and Chinese threats to Greenland, said a European government official, who, like others interviewed for this report, was granted anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly. Respect for territorial integrity cannot be enforced by a land grab, and we should say it out loud. But instead of dealing with the actual threat of war in Ukraine, we'll be sending troops to Greenland.
Trump and members of his administration justify their interest in Greenland by citing the needs of the Golden Dome missile defense system, economic security, and access to mineral resources. At the same time, Denmark has repeatedly signaled its willingness to expand cooperation in all these areas without altering the island's sovereignty. Critics point out that the U.S. already maintains military bases in Greenland and has cooperated closely with Denmark on security matters for decades, making annexation unnecessary to deter Russia and China. European diplomats fear that Trump's rhetoric is playing into Moscow's long-standing strategy of weakening Western alliances. Particular concern was raised by the president's announcement that additional tariffs against the EU could be imposed if allies interfere with transferring Greenland under Washington's control. That's all for today. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your comments.